Thunder cracked across the Texas sky as Bethany Davis lifted her white satin skirts and fled down the aisle of Silver Creek's only church, leaving a wake of gasps and scandalized whispers behind her. The year was 1878, and in a town where traditions were sacred as scripture, a woman abandoning her wedding was tantamount to sacrilege. Yet there she went, veil streaming behind her like a surrender flag in the wind, as her groom, Jasper Thornton, the wealthiest cattle baron in 3 counties, stood slack-jawed at the altar. "Bethany, you get back here this instant." Her father's voice boomed through the church, but she was already pushing through the heavy oak doors, the spring air hitting her flushed face like salvation itself. Rain had just begun to fall, fat droplets splattering against the dusty main street, turning the ground to mud that clung to the hem of her wedding dress. Bethany had no plan beyond escape, no destination other than away. She only knew that marrying Jasper would suffocate her as surely as if he'd placed a pillow over her face. The townsfolk poured out of the church behind her, a stream of Sunday finery and shocked expressions. Mrs. Patterson clutched her pearls so tightly the string nearly snapped. The blacksmith crossed his arms and shook his head. Even old Sheriff Wilson, who'd seen everything in his 60-some years, looked positively bewildered. "She's lost her mind," someone murmured. "Poor Jasper," said another. Bethany didn't care. She kept running, even as the rain intensified, pelting her like tiny bullets of judgment. Her father had arranged this marriage to settle his gambling debts, selling her off like cattle to a man 30 years her senior with a reputation for cruelty behind closed doors. 3 previous wives, all mysteriously ailing before passing. Bethany was 22 and had no intention of becoming the 4th. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the rainfall, and she glanced over her shoulder to see Jasper's men mounting up. Of course, he wouldn't let her go. She was property now, paid for in full with the deed to her father's ranch. Panic surged through her veins as she realized she couldn't outrun horses. The muddy street stretched before her, leading to open country with nowhere to hide. She was doomed. Then she herded another horse approaching fast from the west end of town. Not one of Jasper's men, who were still fumbling with their saddles. This rider moved with purpose, cutting through the downpour like he'd been born to it. He pulled his dappled gray stallion alongside her, leather creaking as he leaned down. Water dripped from the brim of his worn Stetson, and beneath it, Bethany caught sight of striking blue eyes in a sun-weathered face. "Seems like you could use a ride, miss," he said, his voice low and steady against the growing storm. Bethany hesitated for only a heartbeat. Behind her was certain misery. Before her, this stranger offered at least a chance. "Yes," she gasped. In one fluid motion, he extended his arm and she grasped it, feeling herself hauled up behind him with surprising strength. Her wedding dress tangled around her legs as she settled against the cantle. "Hold tight," he instructed, and she wrapped her arms around his waist just as he spurred the horse forward. They thundered down the main street, past gawking townsfolk who scattered to avoid the splashing mud. Jasper's voice bellowed curses from the church steps, and his men were finally mounting up. "They'll follow," Bethany shouted over the rain. "Let them try," the cowboy replied, guiding his horse off the main road and toward the wooded hills that bordered Silver Creek. "I know these hills better than any of those pampered ranch hands." The storm intensified as they climbed higher, lightning splitting the sky in jagged veins of brilliance. The white of her dress glowed eerily with each flash, making her a beacon in the gloom. "I'm Hank," the cowboy called back to her as they navigated a narrow trail between pines. "Hank Novak." "Bethany Davis," she replied, then added with grim humor, "Not Bethany Thornton, thank heaven." Hank's shoulders shook with what might have been laughter. Gathered as much from your dramatic exit. Not fond of the matrimonial state. Not fond of being sold like cattle to a man who's buried 3 wives already, she replied, the words bitter on her tongue. Hank's back stiffened under her hands. Thornton, the cattle baron. She nodded, then realized he couldn't see her. Yes, my father owes him money. I was the payment. Your father sounds like a real prize, Hank muttered. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and thunder followed almost immediately. The horse skittered nervously beneath them. We need shelter, Hank said, scanning the darkening forest. There's an old line shack about 2 miles ahead. We can wait out the worst of it there. Bethany glanced over her shoulder. Through the curtain of rain, she thought she could make out riders in the distance, but it was hard to be certain. Will we make it before they catch up? We will if Diamond has anything to say about it. Hank patted his horse's neck. He's outrun worse than some fancy-pants cattleman's boys. True to his word, Diamond seemed to find hidden reserves of energy, surging forward through the storm with determination that matched his rider's confidence. The trees thickened around them, and the trail narrowed further, barely visible in the fading light. Branches whipped at them, and Bethany ducked her head against Hank's back, grateful for his solid presence between her and the storm. Finally, a small, weathered cabin appeared through the trees. Hank dismounted quickly and helped Bethany down, her sodden wedding dress weighing her like an anchor. He led Diamond to a lean-to beside the cabin, then ushered Bethany inside. The interior was sparse but dry, a small table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow cot against the far wall. Hank immediately set about building a fire while Bethany stood dripping on the rough wooden floor, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance. You're shivering, Hank observed, striking a match to the kindling. There's a blanket on the cot. You should get out of that dress before you catch your death. Bethany flushed. I haven't anything else to wear. Hank glanced up, firelight catching the planes of his face. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with a strong jaw shadowed by dark stubble. There might be some old clothes in that trunk. Line riders keep spare things here sometimes. He turned his attention back to the fire, giving her privacy as she crossed to the wooden trunk he'd indicated. Inside, she found a faded flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that would be comically large on her frame but were mercifully dry. I'll step outside while you change, Hank said, rising as the fire caught properly. But the storm, I need to make sure Diamond is settled anyway. And keep an eye out for our pursuers. After he'd gone, Bethany struggled out of her wedding dress, the buttons and hooks stubbornly resistant to her cold fingers. Finally, free of its sodden weight, she pulled on the borrowed clothes, rolling the trouser legs and sleeves several times. The shirt smelled of tobacco and pine, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. When Hank returned, water streaming from his duster, he paused at the sight of her. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or something warmer before he looked away, removing his coat and hat. Any sign of them? Bethany asked anxiously. They're out there, but this storm has them as confused as wet cats. They've split up, which works in our favor. He hung his wet things near the fire. We should be safe here for tonight at least. Bethany sat in one of the chairs, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. I don't know how to thank you. Hank shrugged, running a hand through his damp brown hair. No need. I've never been one to stand by while someone's in trouble. You don't even know me. I could be the villain in this story. The corner of his mouth quirked up. Are you? No, she said softly, but I am a stranger to you. Well, we've got all night to remedy that, Miss Davis. He pulled the other chair close to the fire. Why don't you tell me what drove you to flee your own wedding in the middle of a storm? So she did. She told him about her father's gambling, about the ultimatum from Jasper Thornton, about her suspicions regarding his previous wives' deaths. She told him how she'd planned to go through with it, until she'd stood at the altar and seen the cold possession in Jasper's eyes, like she was just another piece of property to add to his holdings. I knew then that I'd rather face whatever hardships came than bind myself to that man, she finished, even if it meant running away with nothing but the clothes on my back. Hank listened intently, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, stoking the fire. "Your instincts were right," he finally said. "Thornton's reputation goes beyond Silver Creek. I've worked ranches across 3 states and I've heard stories. His first wife supposedly fell down the stairs. The second caught fever. The third," he hesitated. "Well, let's just say you're better off having run when you did." Thunder rattled the cabin's thin walls and Bethany pulled the blanket tighter. "But what now? I can't go back to Silver Creek. I have no money, no family who'd take me in." Hank considered her with those striking blue eyes. "I'm heading to Colorado. There's work there, good work with fair pay. You could come along at least until you figure out your next move." "As what? Your wife?" Bethany's voice held a defensive edge. He looked genuinely startled, then laughed. "No, madam. As a traveling companion who happens to be fleeing the same direction I'm headed, though I suppose folks will talk either way." Bethany felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous." "It was practical," he corrected. "A woman alone has limited options in these parts, and none of them particularly appealing. But I promise you, Miss Davis, I've got no designs on making you wife number 1, any more than you had on being wife number 4 for Thornton." Despite everything, Bethany found herself smiling. "Colorado, then. And please call me Bethany." "Bethany," he repeated, and something in the way her name sounded in his voice made her heartbeat quicken. They talked through the night as the storm raged outside. Hank told her about growing up on a small farm in Kansas, losing his parents to typhoid when he was 17, and spending the years since working his way west. He'd been a farmhand, a ranch hand, even a deputy sheriff for a spell, but never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. "What are you running from?" Bethany asked as dawn approached, the storm finally subsiding to a gentle patter on the roof. Hank's expression turned thoughtful. "Not running from, running to maybe. Somewhere I fit, somewhere that feels like home." "And you think that's in Colorado, I think." He met her gaze across the dying embers of the fire. "I think home isn't always a place." Something warm and unfamiliar unfurled in Bethany's chest at his words, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Hank was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. "Thornton's men," he confirmed grimly. "3 of them coming up the trail." Bethany's heart sank. "They found us." "They found the cabin," Hank corrected, grabbing his revolver from its holster. "They don't know for certain we're inside." "What do we do?" she whispered. He handed her his hat. "Put this on, keep your head down. Take Diamond out the back. There's a trail that leads down to the creek. Follow it west for about a mile and you'll come to a stand of cottonwoods. Wait for me there." "What about you?" "I'll create a distraction, then follow." Bethany gripped his arm. "I won't leave you to face them alone." His gaze softened, and for a moment he covered her hand with his own. "This isn't your first choice and it won't be your last. Trust me." Something in his steady confidence calmed her racing heart. She nodded, gathering the borrowed clothes around her. "Be careful." "Always am," he replied with a wink that belied the tension in his shoulders. She slipped out the back while Hank positioned himself by the front window, gun ready. Diamond whickered softly as she approached, and she shushed him, leading him carefully away from the cabin. The pre-dawn light was just strong enough to make out the narrow trail Hank had mentioned. Behind her, she heard male voices calling out to the cabin. She couldn't make out the words, but the threatening tone was unmistakable. She hesitated, torn between fleeing as instructed and going back to help somehow. Then came the sharp reports of gunfire, 1, 2, 3 shots in quick succession. Shouts followed, and more gunfire. Bethany's heart seized with fear for Hank. Diamond sensed her distress and stamped nervously. She forced herself to keep moving, leading him down the muddy trail as quietly as possible. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she trusted Hank's judgment. If she returned, she might only make things worse. The trail dipped sharply, following a swollen creek still angry from the night's downpour. Twice, Bethany nearly lost her footing on the slick earth, but Diamond steadied her, seeming to understand the need for caution. True to Hank's directions, about a mile downstream stood a grove of cottonwoods, their new spring leaves vibrant against the clearing sky. Bethany led Diamond into their midst and waited, every sense alert for sounds of pursuit. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sun rose fully, burning away the storm clouds and warming the damp earth. Birds began to sing, impossibly cheerful given her circumstances. Just as Bethany was beginning to fear the worst, she heard a soft whistle. Diamond's ears perked up and he nickered in response. Hank emerged from the trees, his shirt torn at the shoulder and blood staining the fabric, but otherwise whole. Relief washed through Bethany so powerfully that she swayed on her feet. "You're hurt," she said, rushing to him. "Just a graze," he assured her, though his grimace when she touched his arm suggested otherwise. "We need to move. I led them on a false trail north, but they'll figure it out eventually." "Let me bandage this first," Bethany insisted, tearing a strip from the hem of the flannel shirt she wore. Hank submitted with surprising patience as she bound his wound with deft movements. Her father's propensity for getting into scrapes had made her adept at basic first aid. "You've done this before," Hank observed. "My father wasn't only a gambler. He was a brawler too." She tied off the makeshift bandage. "How many were there?" "3, Thornton's foreman and 2 hands." Hank tested his arm's mobility, wincing slightly. "They're still alive if that's what you're asking. I'm not in the habit of killing men just doing their jobs." "Even if their job is hunting me down," Hank's expression hardened. "They won't follow us into Colorado. Thornton may have influence in these parts, but it doesn't extend that far." They mounted Diamond, Bethany behind Hank once more, and set off westward, keeping to the creek where possible to mask their trail. The day grew warm, the aftermath of the storm bringing out wildflowers in surprising bursts of color across the landscape. By midday, they put considerable distance between themselves and the cabin. Hank found a sheltered spot to rest, and they shared the meager provisions from his saddlebags: jerky, hardtack, and water from the creek. "It's not much," he apologized, watching Bethany nibble at the tough jerky. "It's freedom," she replied simply. "I'd take this over Jasper Thornton's finest table any day." Hank studied her with quiet appreciation. "Most women I know would be complaining by now. Wet, cold, running for their lives, eating trail food. Most women you know probably weren't about to be married off to a murderer," Bethany pointed out, but she smiled to soften her words. "Besides, I grew up on a ranch. I'm no stranger to hardship. Even so, this isn't the life most would choose." "I didn't choose it," she reminded him. "But now that it's been thrust upon me, I intend to make the best of it." They continued westward throughout the afternoon, crossing from Texas into the New Mexico territory as the sun began its descent. Hank knew the land well, finding hidden trails and sheltered passes that kept them away from the main routes where Thornton's men might be watching. That night, They camped in a small canyon, the walls providing protection from the wind and hiding their small fire from distant eyes. Bethany found herself studying Hank's profile as he tended the flames, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. "Why were you in Silver Creek?" she asked suddenly. "You said you were heading to Colorado, but Silver Creek isn't exactly on the main route." Hank poked at the fire before answering. "I was tracking someone. A man who robbed a stagecoach up near Amarillo. Trail led me to Silver Creek." "You're a bounty hunter." Bethany felt a flicker of unease. "Sometimes," he admitted, "when the money's good and the man deserves catching." "This one shot a passenger during the robbery, left a little girl without a father. Did you find him?" "I did." Hank's expression remained neutral. "He's in the Silver Creek jail now, waiting for the marshal to transport him to trial." "So you were leaving town when?" "When I saw a bride running like hellfire down the main street, with a storm brewing and trouble on her heels." A smile touched his lips. "It seemed like the sort of situation a gentleman couldn't ignore." "I'm glad you didn't." Bethany held his gaze across the fire, feeling something shift between them. "So am I," he said softly. The days that followed fell into a pattern. They traveled by day, keeping to lesser-known routes, camping by night under stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. Hank taught Bethany how to track, how to move silently through the wilderness, how to tell which plants were edible when their provisions ran low. In turn, she surprised him with her knowledge of horses, her steady hands when redressing his wounded arm, and her unwavering determination despite the difficulties of their journey. They spoke of everything and nothing: childhood memories, hopes for the future, favorite books. Hank had a surprising fondness for poetry and could recite Whitman from memory, his voice taking on a different cadence when he spoke the lines. Bethany told him about her dreams of someday running her own ranch, not as a wife or daughter, but in her own right. "It's possible, you know," Hank told her as they crossed into Colorado territory a week after their flight from Silver Creek. "There are women in Denver, in Boulder, making their own way. The West isn't as set in its ways as back east." "You make it sound so simple," Bethany said, but hope bloomed in her chest at his words. "Not simple," he corrected, "but possible, and possible is all most of us need to keep going." They stopped in a small town called Juniper Springs to replenish their supplies. Bethany remained anxious, scanning every face for signs of recognition, but they were far enough from Texas now that Thornton's influence seemed to have faded. Still, they agreed it was safest for Bethany to remain with Diamond at the edge of town while Hank conducted their business. He returned with not only food and ammunition, but also a simple blue dress and sturdy boots in Bethany's size. "You can't keep wearing those clothes," he explained when she protested the expense. "Besides, we got lucky. The general store had these on discount. Previous owner never claimed them." Bethany changed behind a stand of trees, grateful to be in clothes that actually fit. When she emerged, Hank's expression made something flutter in her stomach. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, his blue eyes warming with admiration. "Better?" she asked, suddenly shy. "Much," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. He cleared his throat. "We should reach Boulder in another 3 days if the weather holds." Boulder. Their destination. The place where they'd part ways, each to their own futures. Bethany nodded, ignoring the pang in her heart at the thought. They camped that night by a clear mountain stream, the air cooler at the higher elevation. After dinner, Hank pulled a small volume from his saddlebag, a book of Whitman's poetry he'd purchased in town. "I thought you might like to read something other than trail signs for a change," he said, handing it to her. Bethany ran her fingers over the leather cover, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. Will you read some to me?" He hesitated, then nodded, accepting the book back and opening to a marked page. His voice, low and melodic, filled the night air with Whitman's words about the open road, about journeys and companions and the beauty of discovery. Bethany watched him read, the firelight casting shadows across his face, and realized with startling clarity that she was falling in love with him. This man who'd risked his life for a stranger, who treated her as an equal, who saw possibility where others saw limitations. When he finished reading, their eyes met across the flames, and she wondered if he could see her feelings written plainly on her face. "Bethany," he began, his voice hesitant in a way she hadn't heard before. But whatever he meant to say was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching. Instantly alert, Hank doused the fire and moved to Diamond, loosening the reins from the tree where he'd been tethered. "Riders," he whispered, helping Bethany gather their belongings. "Could be nothing, but better safe than sorry," she finished for him, already moving with the efficiency their days together had taught her. They retreated deeper into the woods, leading Diamond quietly through the underbrush. From their hidden vantage point, they watched as a group of 5 riders passed along the trail below, their features indistinct in the moonlight. "Bounty hunters," Hank murmured, his arm protectively around Bethany's shoulders. "Not Thornton's men, but they could be working for him. Thornton's not above hiring outside help when his own men fail. Will they track us? Possibly. We should move on, find somewhere more defensible to spend the night." They traveled through the darkness, Hank's expertise guiding them safely despite the lack of light. Eventually, they found shelter in a shallow cave set into a hillside, well hidden by brush and rock formations. As they settled in for what remained of the night, Bethany found herself trembling, not from cold but from the reality of their situation. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I've brought nothing but trouble into your life." Hank turned to her, his expression serious in the dim moonlight filtering through the cave entrance. "Don't ever think that," he said firmly. "Meeting you has been the best thing that's happened to me in a long time. Even with bounty hunters on our trail and a bullet wound in your arm," his mouth quirked up at one corner. "Even with that." Bethany searched his face, finding only sincerity in his gaze. "Why did you really help me that day, Hank? The truth." He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb absently tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I was riding into town when I saw you standing on those church steps in your wedding dress. You looked trapped, like a wild thing in a cage, and then when the storm came and you ran." He shook his head, smiling slightly. "I knew right then I'd follow you anywhere. You didn't even know me. Some things you know without knowing why." His eyes held hers. "Some people you meet and it's like you've known them all your life." Bethany's heart hammered against her ribs. "I feel that too." The confession hung between them, fragile and profound. Hank's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as he leaned forward. Their first kiss was soft, questioning. Their second was not. Bethany's arms wound around his neck as he pulled her closer, the weeks of tension and growing affection crystallizing into something neither could deny any longer. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Hank rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected you," he murmured. "Nor I you," she replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "What happens when we reach Boulder? That depends," he said carefully, "on what you want." "I want to be free," she said immediately, "to make my own choices, build my own life." Something like disappointment flickered in his eyes, but he nodded. "Of course, that's what we've been fighting for." Bethany placed her hand over his heart. "But I also want you if you'll have me." His smile bloomed slowly, transforming his face. "Are you proposing to me, Bethany Davis?" She laughed, the sound echoing in the small cave. "I'm saying I love you, Hank Novak. The rest we can figure out together." He kissed her again, sealing a promise between them. Together, he agreed. They reached Boulder 3 days later without further sign of the bounty hunters. The town spread before them, nestled against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, its streets bustling with the energy of a place still defining itself. Hank knew people there, a former ranger he'd worked with who now owned a boarding house, a livery stable owner who owed him a favor. They found lodging easily enough, with Bethany taking a room at the boarding house while Hank stayed at the livery. Propriety maintained despite the knowing looks from those who saw how they looked at each other. Word came a week later that Jasper Thornton had fallen ill suddenly and died. The news arrived via telegram from the sheriff in Silver Creek to his counterpart in Boulder, who'd been asked to keep an eye out for Bethany. "Heart failure, they're saying," Hank told her as they sat on the boarding house porch that evening. Though there are whispers his cook might have helped it along. Apparently, she was sweet on his second wife. "Justice comes in strange forms," Bethany said quietly. She felt no joy at the news, only a profound relief that the shadow over her life had lifted. "The sheriff says your father's ranch has been sold to cover the debts. There's a small amount left over. He's holding it for you if you want to claim it." Bethany considered this. "Perhaps someday, not yet." "No rush," Hank agreed, taking her hand. "We've got time now," and they did. Over the following months, they built a life in Boulder. Bethany found work at a dress shop, her nimble fingers and eye for detail making her a valuable assistant. Hank took a position with the town marshal, his tracking skills and steady temperament well suited to keeping peace in a growing community. They were married that autumn, with gold aspen leaves providing a canopy of natural decoration. The ceremony was small but joyful, nothing like the somber affair Bethany had fled in Silver Creek. "No regrets?" Hank asked as they swayed together during their first dance as husband and wife. Bethany glanced around at their new friends, at the community that had welcomed them, at the mountains rising majestically in the distant symbols of the freedom and possibility they'd found together. "Not a single one," she assured him, rising on her toes to kiss him as applause broke out around them. "Every step led me to you." Years later, when their children asked how they met, Hank would wink at Bethany before beginning the tale. "Well, the whole town watched as your mother ran from the altar, and I rode beside her through the storm." And Bethany would smile, remembering the rain on her face, the thunder in her heart, and the cowboy who changed the course of her life with a simple offer of help, and the courage to follow wherever the trail might lead.